On the 27th moon of the year of the shining cloud, I awoke in our encampment with a terrible feeling. For 5 days we'd been without motion in any direction, waiting for the knights to give us the order to move east, but it hadn't come. So our days had been spent sharpening our pikes, shaving our arrow points, and at night there were songs and stories as we hoped and prayed a miracle would come for us. But that morning I sensed a stirring among the men, and one by one they woke up, and we could see fire on the horizon. And then here they came, 1,000 men, marching and on horseback, and when I saw them coming over the hill, I put my head in my hands and told myself that I was not certainly dead. I couldn't know that this was the end. But every man in camp despaired, especially when we saw that more and more armies joined the first, until in the end there were thousands of men spread out around us. And we had to move from Red Rael because there was no room in its fields for us all. Preparations were begun for the march, orders were shouted, and we were aligned in columns. All fires were quashed, the wagons were loaded with supplies, the tent struck down. It took hours. Herrick, my only friend, who I now clung to for his bravery so I wouldn't go mad, told me he guessed our journey overland would be only of a single day. He said he could tell this by the amount of supplies we were leaving behind for the wolves. One day, that meant we were all headed for the shore. We started to move at midday, more than 4,000 soldiers, moving through the mud. Word came through the ranks that almost a dozen men hadn't moved from camp. They'd simply stayed and asked to be executed. Stieg, a pikeman, told me he'd seen it happen. The knights were excessively harsh when a man fell out of line or a wagon was slowed. They barked and shouted orders, and we followed them, keeping our heads down. Toward the beginning of dusk, I heard a man sobbing off to my left, and I turned and I saw a young spearman who had broken down, but his step did not slow. At night, when we expected to rest, we did not rest. Torches were lit, and we entered the inchlit forest. We could sometimes see figures, human figures, watching us at a safe distance. These were the woods people, but they may as well have been the angels of death. Later I saw a man and a woman standing close enough that I could make out their faces by the firelight. They had faces like stone idols, without any emotion or sympathy. There was no food for us. We walked all night through the cold. What did the knights care, after all, if we were starved? I heard men fall, but I didn't look back. Just as light came, the order came down for us to slow our movement. We had broken through the woods an hour before, and a quarter hour after that, the knights suddenly galloped ahead, and we saw the sea. 8 great warships waited for us. We ceased movement and then began the laborious process of loading the armies onto them. It was more waiting, but now at least we were allowed to rest, and soup came down the lines and bread, just enough to keep us conscious. The knights sent guards through with assignments, and the armies began to separate from each other. More than anything, I didn't want to be separated from Herrick. I stayed close to him. He cursed the disorganization of the knights under his breath. Something was wrong with him. He clutched his stomach as he spoke. It took more than 2 hours of interminable shuffling and shifting to get us onto the ships. We were moving inch by inch across the gangplank, sometimes stopping. Something thudded beside me. I looked down, and a man had collapsed almost at my feet. It was Herrick. I reached down, and so did the man beside me. Herrick's face was locked in a scream, but no sound emerged. He lay on his side, not moving. A guard came through and hovered over him, and then he pushed me out of the way as I shook Herrick desperately. The guard said, "He's died." He said it very softly. "He's died." It hadn't been an ordinary death. It had been fear that killed him. His face told us so. It was Stieg who kept me from collapsing myself, pushing me on. Inside the galley, I couldn't sleep on the wooden supports. More meaningless hours went by as we waited for the boat to leave the shore, not knowing why we weren't on our way. The men took their places where they could, and we were left alone, the knights and guards collected up on the deck to begin their planning. There were no more warships to come. Every available man had already been called. That night I passed in and out of consciousness, sometimes raising my head when I heard a disturbance strike the water, which I would learn at dawn had been the sound of men throwing themselves from the brig. I saw in the middle of the night a long swordman, still in full armor, staring silently through one of the portholes, and I made my way over to him. I was desperate for human contact, even if it was completely wordless. Our ship was on the far left of the formation of the fleet, and all I could see at first out there was the open ocean. But within minutes, I saw a shape out there on the water, a vessel sailing in the opposite direction, toward Red Rayo. It was a great carrack. The long swordman saw it in real detail before I could, and he invoked the gods in a bloodless whisper. For there was no one on that ship. It drifted without aim across the water, pushed off from somewhere miles and miles away, and our own boat was now turning away from it toward the north in an effort to avoid striking it. It passed close enough so that we could hear the creaking of its masts. This invaluable vessel had no crew, no captain, no troops. They'd been left on Alberiag to die, and none had returned. This was the ship we'd been waiting for in the encampment back in Orain. I could feel men behind us peering out into the dark, watching the boat move past, on its way to its natural end. Shortly after the sun rose, I saw that its color was not as it should have been. There was a faint yellow tinge in the sky, and upon seeing this, one of the Caelic soldiers began to wail and cry out for the gods to sink our ship in mercy. The rest of us, almost to a man, lapsed into a hypnotized silence as we watched the yellow color become more and more intense until we were sailing into a surreal blanket of warm gold, a thick sort of fog of color that drenched every ship. Sir Roderick then appeared in the hold, and the first thing he said to us was, "We are landing on Alberiag." He went on to say that we could, if we wished, write to our loved ones, and our messages would be held on board for the ship's return trip to Red Rael. 2 guards appeared and began to pass out parchment and ink. Sir Roderick began to instruct us then, explaining in the driest terms the plan we were to follow upon disembarking, procedures which we had to follow to absolute precision to save seconds. It would be only a march of 2 miles to our attack point. The ship would touch the shore of Alberiag in less than 6 hours. He spoke further of divisional assignments. For 4 of those 6 hours, the elderly cleric, Christed, led us in a mass that he pushed ever onward. His voice became hoarse. He had to stop for water several times as he spoke every word he could from the Book of the Star. Finally, he could speak no more. The sky above the sea was drenched in a thick amber glow, as if the sun had caught fire and was dying. Sometimes the sky would seemed to flicker, as if lightning were trying to press through from another realm. Night and day had no meaning here, as since the summer of the previous year that sky had remained a constant over Alberiag through every hour. 60 minutes out from shore, we began to hear a sound we'd never known existed. There had been no tales of it. One had to listen close in the beginning to hear it over the waves. It was the sound of 1,000, perhaps 10,000 creatures, not humans, more like animals, baying animals who had congregated and were now emitting a common cry of excitement and anger. It rose slowly all around us, and by the time land came into view to the north, every man was hearing it, and every man, including Sir Roderick, had gone quiet. We began to see through the amber cloak the features of that undefended shore, which seemed so much like our own back home. Sir Roderick commanded us to begin to maneuver into position for a swift disembarkation, which meant pressing against each other near the keel. 4 lancers began to frantically ready the gangplank for lowering. We wedged in so tight against each other that it was difficult to breathe. We had to hope that the steersman would not cause such an abrupt landing that the contact would crush the men in the first ranks. My breath came shorter and shorter as we heard the bottom of the stem scrape the shoals, and then we had landed. A messenger lad shouted out, and the gangway began to lower, allowing that diseased light to flood in. No one hesitated to exit the hold which had held us captive, even though the sound of that cloud of dissenting, angry voices became much louder when the cold air struck us. We lined up on the shore, having very little room to maneuver. We were shoved this way and that by the momentum of whichever soldier moved to one's left and right. The horses, the dogs, the weapons, they were all offloaded from one of the ships with great speed. It was obvious that things were moving much more swiftly than had been planned, because the knights must have sensed the new panic among us that the mysterious outcry of unknown origin was causing. When all men were off the ships, the lines that formed in order to move quickly toward the weapons caches came together fast. The knights had to shout louder and louder to get their words through to us, and many of the men seemed to have stopped responding. Their movements had become as slurred as their speech when drunk. I was handed a halberd, and immediately was urged to start to march. As for sticking to the formations described to us on the ship, this plan seemed to have been almost immediately abandoned. We were to simply go forward as quickly as we could. Almost 4,000 soldiers began to march. I knew no one anymore. The faces were all unfamiliar. We reached grass. A wide field was stretching away from us, but the grass was dead and withered. The tumult of voices was getting louder and louder, coming from just up ahead. Now a man on my left dropped his blade, and when he reached down for it, he stayed on his knees. And then he curled on the cold ground as if wishing to sleep, like a little boy, and no one stopped for him. Another man dropped to the ground. He had lost his footing, and he made a half attempt to rise, but from the despair on his face, I knew that he would not get up again. And his eyes closed, and he collapsed, right there. The knights were urging us over the din to stop for nothing when we engaged. The healers had all been issued weapons as well, so there would be no medicine or treatment for the fallen. On a certain call, they abandoned their horses, leaping from them, and they raised their blades. And at the top of the hill, their shouts became full-throated, red-faced cries, the sound of them utterly lost beneath the enemies. Now our visibility had been cut to just a few hundred yards with the intensity of the amber fog. Over the hill, just up ahead, was the fissure. A crack more than a mile wide, with a mouth 20 feet high. Inside it, utter darkness. Now torches were rapidly lit all around, including mine, as a boy of no more than 14 anointed my free hand with fire. I was out in front. I would be among the first 100 men in, even in front of the mercenary ranks. The cry was put forth to run, and the knights, the bravest among us, did not hesitate from their duty to lead the charge. They began to rush toward the fissure. I ran. The footing beneath me was firm. I could see, reflected off the roof of the fissure, a flicker of light, then another, and another, which meant the enemy was emerging with their own burning torches. We entered that terrible pit as one rampaging, undisciplined mass. I cannot say where the divide truly was between earth and hell, but as soon as my voice abandoned me and my eardrums began to shake with the force of the enemy's echoing collective scream, a face appeared in the darkness, the face of a being that was not meant for even a single step outside the fissure. It had once been a man, or something's imagining of one, but there was no clothing on its body, and its bones were only half protected by human flesh. A skeletal beast it was, 2 feet taller than I, having no eyes and an enormous skull that was hideously bovine. It had not hands but claws, a filthy sword gripped in one, a torch gripped in the other. Its jaws were opening and closing many times in a single second, like a machine come to life. And before I could even raise my own weapon to strike it, Satan's thousands upon thousands of like-bodied atrocities became visible far beyond this one, in the rank and fetid shadows, as their fires broke the darkness, and their counter-invasion